Warning, this podcast has stories of real-life events and true crime that happens every day. These stories may contain adult language and graphic or disturbing details not suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
132 in Bush, I've got him at gunpoint. Check the left phone for going to full evacuation at this time.
They're pulling them out.
1011, advise ready for camp.
God!
Another episode of War Stories. I'm Tom.
And I'm Chuck.
Oh, is that the delay today? Is it that strong? Is it that long of a delay? That was a pretty good one. Now it was okay. That one seemed to be a little long. For those of you that are just tuning, well, not just tuning in for this episode, I want to let everybody know. For some reason, our poor guest has been dealing with Chuck and I for 15 minutes now. Dealing with technical problems. So I appreciate you hanging in there. We have a guest this week. His name is Larry Sims. Chuck, tell us about Larry. And or maybe I should, because I actually met Larry first, maybe, and then you can talk about I don't know. How should we do that?
Sure, whatever. I'm coming back to the future right now. So
that's right. Your time, just so you know, your delay is getting better. It might have just been.
Oh, is it really? That's good.
Yeah. I recently attended a couple of incident command system courses as part of my job, and it was the more advanced incident command courses, not the basic ones that you can take online. Some of this stuff you have taken class, and we had two really, really good instructors from guess what service, Chuck? Which, if I were to ask you what service, what division, what department, what career path does the incident command system best, who would you say?
Wildland.
Wildland? Okay. Well, we have Larry. Larry is an expert on the incident command system and a career firefighter, retired fire chief, and all-around good man. Welcome to the show, Larry. How are you?
Good. I'm pleased to be here.
And now the reason I brought up that course is because you were one of the instructors of that course. And I enjoyed. Let me put it to you this way: I know Larry's a good instructor because if you can keep my attention span through 3 days of an ICS class devoted to paperwork, which Larry was able to do, it was 3 days on paperwork. You guys, 3 days on paperwork. It was, and Larry was able to at least make it, tolerable. So thank you, Larry. How are you?
Okay, good. Yeah, that's one of the challenges in that course is keeping people's interest up.
Now, why don't you, for our listeners, kind of give us a Reader's Digest overview of your career path that took you into. Well, actually, let me back up. So, who is the best at ICS in your experience?
In my experience,
FEMA.
yeah, not FEMA. No, I would say probably the fire service uses it the most. Yet, organizations like Team Rubicon, the military, they also use the system. The police use it, but they may not call it incident command.
Mm-hmm.
It may be they don't realize they're actually using it every day. Right.
Oh yeah.
Right. And it was said at a recent class, and I think you were the instructor. I don't know if you were you might not have been in the room when this was said, but one of the reasons that firefighters are better at ICS than cops is that despite the fact that cops are using the incident command system, cops typically show up to calls in a one-man shop, maybe a two-man shop.
Right.
Whereas firefighters roll up as a team to everything. Right. There's 4 or 5 guys on every call. Right.
Well, there's usually 4 or 5 minimum, sometimes as many as 100.
Right.
And it's better to be set up ahead of time rather than Johnny come lately to the program.
Right. And in a particular shift as a police officer, if it's a slow shift, you might have a call where there's 4 people on it max. Right.
And I think a lot of cops don't understand like what ICS is because they've never heard it. My agency, we heard it all the time. We went to school for it. We did courses on it. ICS this, ICS that, ICS this BS. But what you're actually using when you have to, ICS BS, dude, when you're calling out air, like airships, you're calling out mutual aid, or you're doing like, hey, let me get the next city over, or like, which is mutual aid, or the next division over, I need them to come over here, and you're like setting up a perimeter. You're actually utilizing the incident command system. And then when you get relieved, and someone else gets more that has more things it's better suited to call the shots, they take over, you get relieved. You may have been first on scene, and now you relay all that information to them. You're actually utilizing the incident command system. You just don't know it, because like Larry said, a lot of agencies don't teach you what the incident command system is. They're just like, hey, this is how we're going to attack the problem. And that's what it is. But I think Fire, when you asked me that question earlier, Fire definitely uses it way more, because, and I said Wildland. I'm thinking Wildland because I just got done watching that Cal Fire show on fucking like CBS or NBC or whatever it was. Hey, so, but they're utilizing, people bringing in tractors. They're bringing in, all these hotshot crews. They're bringing in smoke jumpers. They're bringing in freaking medical. They're bringing in trucks. They're bringing in engines, because you never know if you have a adjoining town that they have to go and put out spot fires that are setting up, and they're controlling so many units, and they have this massive command CP. And I've seen some of these massive command CPs, and they are fucking massive. Unlike anything I've ever dealt with on any major incident, fires are like the bee's knees when it comes to the ICS system, and other than like Hurricane Katrina style shit, you know what I mean? Where you have like National Guard, fire, police, everybody, and then, whoever's calling the shots there. But I would say on like a state level, yeah, definitely fire for sure.
Well, on the incident command team that I was on, my first incident, we doubled the town's population overnight.
Whoa, dude, exactly what I'm talking about. That's great. That's wild. So many people.
Yeah. So give us a little bit of your career, Larry, as we get into some of your stories. Because you retired as a fire chief.
Right. I retired as a fire chief, 20 years as the chief. I started in the fire service as a volunteer and became the first paid fire chief on an all volunteer department. So it was all volunteers that I dealt with. But 20 years was a long time. If you look at many fire departments, that's unusual for a chief to last that long. I'm kind of proud of that, but at the same time, I'm not saying that I'm exceptional, and that's why.
Right. Sure. And so how did you end up getting into the fire service?
Well, I was actually had another job. I was in customer service, servicing technical equipment. And there was an accident out right by my house. I went out, and the current fire chief says, hey, why don't you join? So I did. The next accident we had, I had to stand with my hands in my pockets and watch somebody bleed, because I was not trained in medical. And I said, that ain't going to happen again. So I went and became an emergency medical technician.
Okay.
And that moved on from there.
That is kind of a stepping stone for the fire, because people often reach out to us, be like, what do I need to do to prepare this and anything? And I'm just letting you know, EMT is one of the basic stepping stones for anybody that if you don't know, I'm telling you, putting yourself through EMT school and applying as a volunteer for small fire departments is a really good way to start your career.
Well,
LA City.
You have to start out that way, because fire departments anymore, because we've gotten very good at prevention, are basically medical organizations that occasionally do fire.
Right. Yeah. More medicals than anything. Sometimes the medicals are the brunt of your calls.
Well, and so that's interesting you bring that up, because I always joke that medical service was how firefighters were able to figure out a way to get paid full time to do what they did, because up until a certain point, most fire departments were volunteer with, they weren't full time. They didn't have standing fire companies. It was, there's a fire, put out the alarm and get everybody to show up to put it out, go grab the equipment, and Larry, I know that the medical component has been a big addition in the last century towards making sure firefighters could stay full time.
Well, that's true. 80% of the calls are or more are EMS or medical. But at the same time, 70 to 75% of fire departments in the United States are volunteer.
Right. It's still a lot of volunteer firefighters out there. There's very few agencies. I mean, you take, a state fire agency or a big city like Chicago and New York or LA, you're talking about thousands and thousands of firefighters. But for the average town, for the average city, that's not the case.
And even with a large city, no fire department has enough personnel on duty at any time to deal with any kind of a fire. And so the mutual aid and calling in those volunteer departments and other paid departments is crucial.
Right. LA's got a lot of firefighters, but they still have to call mutual aid, and they still have to go help out people and get people to help them out on really big stuff.
LA City, a while back, probably probably about 8 years ago, was requiring everyone who came in had to be an EMT already, not become EMT in the academy now because of some lawsuits and shit. Now they have to pass before they graduate the EMT course in the academy, so they don't even have to have an EMT background anymore. What I thought was interesting, and I think there are still some places around the country, especially the volunteer places, that don't require EMT.
Yeah, but you're talking about an agency that has 30,000 people show up to test for 300 jobs.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. Like, why wouldn't they require EMT anymore? Like, it's so weird. You get it in the academy. That's weird.
I know.
Yeah.
So Larry, now you ended up as a fire chief, and then because of your, is it? Did you study ICS, or is it because of your career trajectory and how many times you've used it, you became an expert?
Well, I started out, my first class I took as just a basic firefighter was, I think, in the 80s sometime. And then
the early development of it.
Right. And I wanted to find out how it actually worked. So I had some contacts with the state and federal fire service, and I asked them, could I come out and see what it's about? Well, they interviewed myself and 10 people for a liaison officer, and I got selected and assigned to a team. And so for 10 years, I was on a type 2 incident management team.
Wow.
And when I started, there was no training. There was no book. It was kind of like,
it was the Wild West.
You are it.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like being an incident commander now. If there's not somebody that's doing it, you're doing it.
That's true.
Right. If there's, look to your left and look to your right. If there's nobody else doing the job, you're it.
Well, and somebody's got to be in charge. I don't care whether you're two people on a call. Somebody's got to be in charge. And I've been asked. We had a bomb threat when actually there was 5 pipe bombs. Law enforcement got there. It was a deputy on duty, and in order to call the bomb squad, it required calling a state communications center and making the request formally. But somebody had to be the incident commander to do that.
Right.
Basically, the sergeant called me on the phone and says, "Would you do this?" And I said, "Okay." So I became the incident commander of a law enforcement incident.
Wow.
Now, why, man, why wouldn't he just declare himself the incident commander and call?
Well, because the sergeant wasn't there. It was just the deputy. And the deputy didn't have the experience. And I've got enough background having, my father was a reserve sheriff in LA. I've got 2 uncles that were in the LA police department. So I've got enough knowledge on law enforcement side that I could deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, I would have thought you could just say, "Hey, I'm the incident commander. I'm making the request for the bomb squad."
Yeah, it was a little more complicated than that.
Sure. So now as you look in, the floor is yours. As we go through your career, we are excited here. I mean, you've got to have some pretty interesting stories spanning that big of a career.
34 years worth.
That's a long time to be showing up on someone's worst day.
And basically that was it. I figured I was successful if I made one person's day better on the worst day of their life, whatever that may be.
Right.
It could be minor or it could be major. And I was talking with my deputy chief one time, and I told him in that 35 years or 34 years, we probably were up close and personal with more deceased victims than most military people are.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
Yeah,
military
probably.
is usually further away. They're not up close and personal. And some of those up close and personal ones get very graphic.
Yeah. I mean, I would put, so the difference is like, I think with the military guys is when the casualty goes down, because they're of the distance, it's usually someone they know, right? Because the
Right.
only people close to them are people they know and people on their side, right?
Right.
But then there's the second component where you get into a war zone and you start seeing casualties basically that are on the battlefield when you start to occupy or you enter in. You know, you'll see casualties that are the victims of your fire, of enemy fire, of whatever it is, right? You see that stuff. But that's like concentrated into a small period of time during the battle. And it's interesting. I just watched Band of Brothers for Memorial Day / the anniversary of D-Day because my daughter and my son-in-law had never finished it. So I watched it, and it struck me because I met one of the guys from Easy Company, and he had mentioned, you know, I'd mentioned that I'd never served in the military, but I'd been a police officer. And he said, "Oh, thank you for your service." And I said, "No, it's not the same thing." He goes, "No, it's harder. You guys had a 20-year deployment. My deployment was only 2 years."
And I think that's true.
And I didn't, it struck me because I was so young in my career then. And then now I think it applies to what you're talking about, Larry. You're talking about, you didn't go for a year and see a bunch of dead bodies in a very short period of time and then go spend the next 40 years of your life trying to forget about it. You spent 34 years of your life seeing something horrific happen to your fellow man every day, at least once a day.
Yeah.
And I think you're talking about massive amounts of trauma over a very short period of time, or you're talking about like regular amounts of trauma, but that become massive when you see how they're spread over 34 years. I guess it's the difference between taking a drop of poison every day for 10 years versus drinking a shot glass of poison once.
Yeah, I guess you could look at it that way. You know, and some of the calls that we had, you know, they were fairly benign, but then other calls, you know, they get pretty intense. And, you know, I mean, I've gone into scenes where I had a deceased person, been deceased for 3 or 4 days, pretty ugly. And I kept the rest of my crew out because they didn't need to see that.
Yeah. Well, so we have a gag on our show, no pun intended, I guess, because I didn't even think about it. Chuck is one of the only cops I know with a very, very weak stomach. And we've joked,
That's
like,
true.
there have been calls where he has literally told his trainee, "You're handling this, I'll throw up." Right.
You're like,
And he fully admit, like, we have a contest when we do this show live with our listeners. Sometimes they'll send in stuff to see if, you know, they can make him almost throw up, and they have.
yeah.
But I remember, to your point, and this is why I bring it up. I remember there was a training car on, so it was a FTO and his trainee, and then I was rolling a solo car, and we got dispatched to, you know, an unresponsive elderly female. And that's always how it comes out for us, you know, unresponsive subject. You know, the dispatchers can't tell you they're dead, even though somebody called them up and says, "Hey, I found my grandma. She's dead." Right? They don't say on the radio, "You're going to a dead body." But, you know, based on kind of the words. So I go there. I start rolling over there because the training car, I wanted to see how the trainee was going to deal with his first dead body. It was 100 degrees, and it had been 100 degrees for 2 weeks.
Oh.
And grandma had been down for 5 or 6 days in the house with the air conditioner off. And all
boy.
the windows shut.
Been there, done that.
Oh,
Got the
Yeah.
t-shirt.
So
my gosh,
I
that's so-
showed up, and God bless him if you're out there listening, Captain Tom Way from the fire department was walking out. And I said, "How bad?" And he goes, "It's bad." And I went, "Oh, really? Oh, I can't wait to see." And I was being sarcastic, and he goes, "Don't go in there." I said, "What?" And he goes, I said, "It's not my call. I don't have to go in there, but I was just going to go take a peek with how the trainee was dealing with it." He goes, "I'm keeping my guys out you can see she's dead. You can make the declaration from 20 feet away. You don't need to check for a pulse. It's bad. It was not, she had just died in her sleep, but it was 5 days in 100-degree weather with the windows and door shut. Was not good.
No.
And I saw pictures of it later. And if you don't think you can smell a picture, let me tell you, you can smell a picture.
Oh yeah.
And so I can appreciate calls where, Larry, you're talking about, you go in and as the boss, you go, all right, as we need as few people as possible coming in here because you don't need to deal with this.
Well, and I just need to secure the scene because if it's at a residence, it's got to be investigated as potential crime. So we don't want to disturb any possible evidence too. So, I mean, there was two sides to that.
Oh, I wish you had been the chief of our fire department. We had fire captains that would cut down victims of hangings and cover them with dirty from the yard. Like it was, and they were like trying to be nice to the family, and they would just, it was awful. We're like, dude, that's a potential crime scene.
Yeah, they're all potential crime scenes.
Yeah. Do you have anything that sticks out? Like you show up and you go, I wish I could erase that one.
I think the one that I would want to erase is, as you and I were talking earlier, would be probably a suicide where a gentleman sat on the train tracks and waited for the train.
Oh,
it was not pretty. It was spread out bits and pieces over a quarter mile. Yeah. And we wound up having to assist the coroner with finding all of the bits and pieces, cleaning it up afterwards. And, you know, some of the pieces were recognizable as, okay, this is a body part. Some pieces were not. It was just a piece of flesh that was bloody.
Right.
And then we had to go and wash everything down when we were done. But we had to leave everything in place until the coroner got through with his investigation.
Right. So that's a lot of standing around.
Yeah, it's you know, it just, we had to stand around, and some of the volunteers that were there, you know, they handled it pretty well, but we had a debrief afterwards, you know. And now, it was a tough one, you know. And I think the other one that stands out was we had a deceased where a pickup truck got hit by a train, twisted more ways than I can even imagine a truck. And I didn't find out till halfway through the incident that one of the firefighters that was there, that was his first call ever.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
You know, so I had to subsequently follow up with him to make sure he was okay and doing all right with the psychological impact.
Yeah.
How long did it take for you guys to start doing that as an agency? Right. If you started in the 80s, right? When did the notion that you should check on the younger guys when it's their first time on horrific scenes become a thing? Because I'm trying to track down.
For me, it began right off. It began right away.
Yeah.
We got formal with it probably in the late 80s, and we had a critical incident stress debrief team set up, which would include department members, a mental health professional, and we'd have a debrief where basically it was not a point fingers. It was, you could say anything you wanted. It was a closed session, only people that had been on scene. And it was very helpful because I know I had a near drowning that I was doing CPR on a young man that was a juvenile and basically taking care of business. After the helicopter took him off, I think I got 50 feet and I hit my knees because I couldn't walk anymore. And, you know, a neighbor came up in that case and helped me through that.
Oh, wow.
I remember I had one. It was a juvenile. I've talked a little bit about it on the show, but it was where my job was I was there for the kid. Then I went and did death notification, and then I went and hung out with the officer that had struck him with his patrol car, or the kid, because the kid basically was riding a dirt bike and rode it into the front end of a police car at code 3.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, you know, when you're bike hits the push bars and your head hits the teardrop spotlight on the A pillar.
Fuck.
Luckily he was wearing a helmet, and he survived, but he broke both his arms and his leg in 5 places. And I can tell you to this day that there are certain videos on the internet, and the guys in our group know this, that if it's MMA, it's usually in MMA or it's in gym videos where somebody is working out or they're boxing, or they're fighting, and a bone that should be solid immediately fails. And your shin bone collapses in half, or your forearm collapses in half, or there's all those videos where you can see somebody's bone break, right? While
Like where they kick, where they do it and they get check a kick. Someone checks a kick, and the other person basically goes shin to shin, and they go to step back, and then it flops back, and then they on their freaking shin.
Okay, now that we're talking about it, I'm already a little. So the reason
I can tell you from experience, a leg can wrap 3 times around a shaft. A piece of farm equipment.
So okay, let's talk about that then. So you bring that up. What happened with that? Because that's pretty interesting.
Well, you just you do the best you can to remove the equipment from the victim. I don't recall whether he survived or not. I would kind of doubt it because that's probably going to be a femoral bleed, which doesn't give you much time.
Right.
And it's just you look at it and you say, "Wow,
what was the equipment
possible?"
What was the equipment?
Tractor.
Oof.
3-point hit.
The leg got sucked up and just.
Yep. Went back while it was running, and that was all she wrote.
And it just occurred to me that if you're a firefighter in an industrial area, you're going to go to industrial accidents, right? But
Correct.
You were a firefighter in an area that had farms.
Yep.
And you probably went to quite a few farming accidents.
A few, not that many really, but enough.
Maybe farmers have dialed it in where they're like, don't put your hand there.
Yeah, well, and like I knew other firefighters that had responded to like a guy that fell in a chipper at a lumber mill.
Right.
When that call went out, I actually listened to it on the radio, and you could tell from the dispatcher's voice that she was shook.
Yeah.
Wow, dude.
We talked to one person who famously went to a wood chipper story. And then I talked to somebody a year and a half later, and he goes, "Oh yeah, I've been to 4 of them." And I went, "What?
How?"
And that's the things where I wonder, how do you deal mentally with having been to 4 of them? I know what it was like hearing secondhand about one of them, and you're talking about a dispatcher being shaken by hearing a guy go into it. You said it was a lumber mill?
Yeah, it was a lumber mill.
And part of that I'm curious about, if it is a lumber mill, at what point, the wood chipper, right? They called because they didn't know what they had. But when I talked to the firefighter who dealt with that, at some point, the only reason you're there is because you have a hose.
Pretty much. It's just you have hamburger to clean.
Right, exactly.
So the guy you're talking about went all the way through it, didn't get stuck partially.
I think. I don't know. I wasn't on the call. I just heard the radio traffic.
Right. And so you, again, dealing with rural stuff, I've been to train stuff. You've been to train stuff. Trains always win, by the way, in case you're curious.
They always win.
Trains always, they've got the right of weight. It's kind of like the lug nut rule. If you don't know the lug nut rule, you count up all the lug nuts. Whichever vehicle has more lug nuts wins. That's.
Well, have any of you guys ever been to a train incident where the person got struck by a train, but never got obliterated?
We were actually we were on one where the gal got hit by a train. Car was upside down. We cut her loose. She was conscious, alert. Got her to the hospital, and I went with the ambulance. And the doctor says, "What happened?" And we said, "Well, she was hit by a train." And he looked at us and says, "No, she wasn't. She's not hurt bad enough." And she survived.
Wow.
So
I mean, Lansing Blow, maybe slow speed train. I don't know.
Who knows? All we know is she was upside down. We cut the seatbelt, got her out, and took her to the hospital.
Yeah.
wow, so that reminds me of an incident when I was in the Marine Corps. I was in amphibious assault vehicles, and we had we rode on things called tank pads, and our tank trails. And you go over tank pads that were over the concrete. They were specialized, like reinforced pieces of concrete when you drive over the road, and it was a continuation for the tank trail. Well, we had road guards, and they would often be off. Like if it was on a weekend, they would come. They would be in their vehicles, and a lot of them would park on the tank trail itself instead of actually on the road, recessed off of the tank pad itself. And then they would go out. But this one guy decided, it's late. Fuck it. I'm just going to sit on the tank trail and I'm going to come off onto the side, so they can still pass and I won't be in the way. And he was in like a Tacoma or something. And he fell asleep in it, and it was dark, and the tracks were rolling across. And it was actually on my field op, and we were coming back, but we were so far behind that we got the traffic. Hey, stop. We just ran over a vehicle. Well, one of the Marines who was doing the road guard crossing for us right before we were getting back to our ramp, he was asleep in his vehicle. It was dark. No one could see. Lights were shitty halogen lights. And they didn't see the truck because it was like a black truck, and they ran that motherfucker over with the guy inside, with the Marine inside, and he lived. And I'm like, dude, your truck just got ran over by a track.
That's one lucky person.
Well,
Yeah,
and that's like I have not experienced people that get hit by a train and don't explode, right?
Really?
No, but I did experience two. I call them rubber chickens, right? And it's because the first time I ever saw an accident like this, that was what the firefighter referred to it as. We had a woman who was driving an old Explorer, Ford Explorer, and she had a head-on collision with a pickup truck that had one of those giant cages in the bed to collect old tires, right? So you're talking about a truck with a 8-foot tall cage in the back, loaded down with used tires. So the weight of this truck was outrageous, and they had a 55 mile an hour, 60 mile an hour head-on collision. The woman in the Explorer, she was dead on arrival, and it appeared as if she didn't have one unbroken bone in her body, yet her skin was completely intact.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
how does that right? Like, so I understand what you're talking about. She shouldn't have been intact. She should have been, like, to your point, they should have said, no, she's not bad enough. Like, if you say she's dead and she got in a head-on collision with a tire truck, and then you look at her laying on the bed or on the gurney, you're like, okay, well, she doesn't look that bad. The problem was there was no structure to her anymore, right? And that
Skin
was, I
sack
guess,
with the jello inside.
right. That's what they called her, a rubber chick. I've talked to firefighters that have, dealt with motorcycle riders. Have you ever dealt with one that's being held together by their riding gear?
Not that bad. I've got a lot of riding gear off. A lot of
There are probably so many motorcyclists that are mad at you.
Actually, I had one thank me for cutting his leathers.
Did he?
Yeah.
I've always heard EMT. I've heard it myself, and then I've heard so many EMTs and paramedics and firefighters complain. They go to a motorcycle accident, and the first thing the motorcycle rider says is, "Don't cut my fucking leathers."
Oh yeah, you hear that a lot.
Yeah.
And basically, if it's bad enough, you tell them, "Well, I don't cut your leathers, you die."
Right.
If you cut your leathers, you might live.
Right.
And one thing is, it's amazing. The human body is pretty frail, but it's also amazing how much abuse it can take and still
Just ask Keith Richards.
live.
Yeah. It is amazing. The things that people can survive, like the woman. What was the woman that she fell out of an airplane, or she was sucked out of an airplane in a plane crash, but she stayed seat belted to her row of seats because she was in a row, of seats by herself, right? So she was in a row of 3 or 4 seats. The entire row got sucked out of the plane.
Was it a Boeing plane?
She stayed seat belted into it, and between the row of seats acting like a glider, and the tree canopy catching her, she completely survived getting sucked out of a plane.
Fuck, I bet she doesn't fly anymore.
And then lived in the forest for a week waiting for people to find her.
Oh, I would sue the fuck out of Boeing.
I don't know that it was Boeing. I don't want to say that it
Well,
was
that's
Boeing.
better than the bowling ball that landed on a guy.
Wait, what?
Holy shit.
Oh yeah, that happened in Mexico a few years ago. Bowling ball fell out of the cargo area, and it actually hit somebody in the head.
And of course, fatal.
Oh yeah, 30,000 foot. You
30
know,
A bowling ball at 120 miles. Is terminal velocity 120 miles on a bowling? What's terminal velocity on that? I don't know, but it's going to reach terminal velocity before it touches your head.
oh yeah.
Okay, so what's the weirdest one? Right, we've talked about some crazy. Like everybody I know who's done this job long enough has one where they go, "Oh, you'll never believe this shit." Right?
I think the weirdest one we got was a call to a bar, and we get called out. They don't page the medic. You know, they just page us as a quick response and an ambulance to transport, basic life support. And we get there, and the guy's having a little trouble breathing. We start examining him, look on his side, and there's an indentation about an inch in diameter and about an inch and a half deep on the side of his chest. I immediately called for a medic, and the medic gets there and says, "Well, what'd you call me for? This is no big deal," until he saw the wound and said, "Oh, now I know." And the guy basically, other than a little trouble breathing, minor, was fine. But he had landed on a piece of rebar during a, I don't know, being drunk or fight. It didn't puncture. It just made an indentation.
Ooh,
Lucky.
wow. So just blunt force trauma off of a piece of rebar.
Right, just blunt force trauma, you know. And
See, my old man told me about rebar. Growing up, I've always had this weird like respect for rebar because my dad told me about a call he went. Guy fell on a construction site backwards. The rebar went through the base of his skull at the cerebellum and came out between his eyes.
Yeah,
and he survived.
Yeah, I've heard of that before.
So he's talking and looking around, and he's like stuck because obviously he's got a piece of rebar in his head. He's like, it's like a toothpick skewering him to the charcuterie board. And my dad said, the only thing they could do was like wrap the rebar enough to dampen the vibrations,
Cut it
so
off,
that
send him in.
get a metal saw out and cut it off, and then transport him to the hospital with the rebar in his head.
Oh yeah, because if you pull it out, you're going to unplug some stuff that's plugged.
Right. There's actually an account I follow on social media that deals with it's called North American Rescue. There's one, Savage Paramedics, North American Rescue, free plugs, fuck them. They have a thing where they will show pictures of wounds and stuff like that, or they'll show videos of wounds, and they'll ask, "What would you do in this situation?" And I follow them because I find that stuff is useful, right? To look at a wound and go, "Oh, what would I do with this?" Ooh, and then they'll, in the comments, you'll see a bunch of people that'll like, "You should do this, you should do this," and they'll respond, "Yeah, you got to remember this, that, and the other thing." Matt follows it as well. One of our other co-hosts, who's now an EMT, was in the Navy, and I mean, there's some weird, like you're talking about, the human body is resilient and can survive some weird stuff. And yet, like, it's the same thing with bullets, because I've seen 22s kill people and 45s not. Right. And I've seen a shot in the head that doesn't kill because it bisects the cranium, but a shot in the ass goes right up into your heart and kills you.
Yep.
Well,
and the 22 fragment's so bad that you get bits and pieces going every which way.
Yeah.
Right.
There's like that guy in LA. He was running from the cops, and he got impaled on a piece of metal in a parking structure, and then was just walking around all pale. He was a black dude, and he looked white because of how pale his skin was, because of how much shock he was in. And he was just walking around like a zombie with this big freaking piece of metal sticking out from his back, like going out through his chest. And he was alive walking around. And I don't know if he survived or not, but yeah, he was just walking around with that shit impaled in him. And before we get too far into it, your terminal velocity of a bowling ball is 300 miles per hour.
Yeah.
you had to look it up.
Some damage.
I did. I looked it up. I wasn't about to do the math, so I just searched that. But yeah, it's 300 miles an hour. So you get hit in the dome with that, your head's coming off.
Yep. Anyway,
That's pretty funny. It's so funny. You can look up like the internet's a crazy place. So Larry, you've been to an incident. You said something earlier that I wanted to touch on before we run out of time. We're almost out of time. You said that you once went to an incident where you doubled the size of the population of the area you were at.
Yep. Town had a population of 300. We had 300 firefighters overnight, and it was a 72,000 acre fire.
72,000 acre fire. Okay, so why does 72,000 acres? Why does 300 firefighters seem like not enough?
Well, basically, it was in a mountainous area. This was in southern Idaho. It didn't really threaten structures too closely, but it was values at risk were timber and cattle ranchers. There was a lot of cattle ranches in the area. Mm-hmm. And it was very tough to get to. So there wasn't a whole lot we could do except do some dozer lines and, try a containment policy. If it did get close to structures, we were using aircraft. But by the time it was done, we were actually affecting 3 counties in Idaho and the state of Utah. So for my first incident, that was kind of interesting.
Wow. That was the first one?
Yeah, that was the first one I went on. No experience. And
on that Type 2 team?
Yep.
Wow.
And you learn by going. And the interesting thing was the local fire chief got all mad because, well, how did I get that job and not him? And it's like, well, my incident commander said he's got the experience, he's got some knowledge, and we chose him.
Well, and that's something that people don't understand about incident command system in general, but it is a meritocracy, 100%. You pick the best person for the job, period. And
it doesn't matter. You might be a chief, but you may be working for a firefighter or a lieutenant or a police officer because he's got the experience for the position he's in.
Yeah, we all know chiefs and lieutenants and stuff don't have enough field experience to do the job anymore.
No. Oh, that's right. They, a few years ago they quit letting me play inside.
Right. Well, at some point so much that you just slow things down when you show up.
Well, yeah, that's true. And you've got to look at the big picture. The guys that are doing the actual boots on the ground, they're focused on what their job is.
Right.
But you have to have somebody that can step back and say, okay, what's this big picture? Oh, I need to involve the press, or the press is here. I need to talk to stakeholders who are here. I need to talk to the county sheriff, the county commissioner.
Yeah.
Whoever it is.
It was put simply to me that at some point in your career, you either become a neck up job type person, or if you stay a neck down job type person, you will never go past that, right? Like at some point you promote your skill set, your mind, the way your brain works, the way you're able to think of things, the way you're able to articulate things. Your skill set grows and catches up with your mental capacity for tactics and planning and logistics. And if you have the head for it, you'll promote, you'll move into these positions where you start doing what was told to me as the work from the neck up, right? So at some point, what's going on between your ears tactically and the decision process and what you're saying from that 30,000 foot view, that level of thinking becomes important enough to be its own job. And that's the person who doesn't need to be hand digging lines or, putting wet stuff on the red stuff, or, that you should now take your skill set and dedicate it where it needs to be dedicated. It's kind of that combat idea in the military where you're a major, you don't pick up a rifle and storm the town. You let the privates do that. You have to think big picture about it. And I think that's probably what you're referring to, is at some point you're
you need to take an 80 penny nail and nail your boots to the ground so you don't move and let the other guys do the work.
Right. And it's frustrating because you want to do the work.
Oh, we're all type A personalities. Mm-hmm. We're all, let's take care of the problem.
Right.
But you need to have that ability to stay put. And it took me a while to get there.
Well, I'll be straight up. I miss chasing bad guys, getting in foot pursuits, getting in fights. Like, I miss all that stuff. But that's a young man's game.
Oh yeah.
You know, it's
There's
funny
no
as
way I could do with it what I did 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I was talking to my wife and my son-in-law about this. My son-in-law was Marine, and he and I have discussed, like, if things ever, go to shit, right? You always have to have a plan and have a backup plan and all that. And we've discussed, like, oh my God, what would happen if another country invaded? What would happen if we had a civil war? What would happen if the power grid goes down? What would happen if, all those kinds of things? And one of the things I told him, I said, dude, my mental, skill set has now exceeded my physical abilities. And I think what I would end up being is I would not be on the front lines. They would end up using me to train people and teach classes and come up with plans, because unfortunately I'm now past the part where I can do the neck down physical stuff as well as some of the 20-year-old guys can. I've still got crazy old man strength, and I can. What's that? I ain't as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was.
Yeah,
I can do it once, but I don't know if I could do it in a sustained manner.
Right.
And I think that's what you're talking about. Like, at some point, you develop your skill set so that you're a neck up type person. And clearly, Larry, when you show up and you're bringing 300 firefighters with you to your first incident, you've clearly got enough skills and enough experience for this chief, who should have reasonably recognized it's about the best man for the job. It's not about the rank.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there are organizations out there where it is still all about the rank, and some people who are of that mindset. And that's,
I was going to say, yeah, it's not just, I think, I think there are people that feel that way, even, and that feel that way and belong to organizations that don't.
True.
Which is difficult, because then you're at the, you're at the whim and fancy of the personality of whatever leader you get. But I think it's worse when it's an organization or organizational structure and it's baked into the way that organization does things, because then there is no fighting against it. It just is what it is. Like, that's the way we've always done it.
Yep, which is the wrong attitude.
Right. But see, what's funny is it's the opposite side of the spectrum. From the wrong attitude on the other side of the spectrum is, well, let's change things just because I'm new. Like, a new boss comes in and says, I'm going to change everything, and doesn't bother to look and see what works.
Oh, that's the wrong way to go. I was interviewed once and asked what I would do my first 30 days on the job, and I told them I would do nothing but watch.
Right.
You need to see how they perform, how they do it, what can be improved, what should you leave the same that's working well.
Yeah. Who are my assets? Who are my liabilities? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Where can my organization improve? Because our efficiencies are not great. But where are we really efficient? What do we do well? What do we not do well? Again, all of these questions are things that as a leader you have to ask yourself. And I think that goes to what you're talking about being, sometimes it has to take that 30,000 foot view. Go ahead, Chuck.
Mm-hmm. The people I see that come in that want to change absolutely everything, they come in, they're like, this is the way we're going to do it from here on out, and don't really give a chance to, like, okay, hey, see how we operate, see what's going on, see what works and see what doesn't work in your opinion. But when they come in and when they want to change it all the way, those are the ones who are just looking to promote and be out in a year.
Well, we
come
actually
up and
had a person in another organization, and his standard thing was, well, the way we did it where I came from.
Right.
And
that's the wrong attitude, man.
That's the wrong attitude. And you say that and you lose all credibility.
And it's so powerful. That kind of mindset is so powerful. I'll tell you a quick joke, is at my agency, we had an expression and we named a specific city, and it was always, well, back in such and such city. And it was because early on in the organization, they had a police officer that worked there so long that the answer to any question of what we should do was always, well, back when I worked at such and such,
yeah,
this is what we did. And so because that was his standard response, he didn't have any new innovation. It was always the way we used to do it. The answer to anything at our agency actually over the course of like a decade had the running gag that everybody would just say, well, back when I worked in such and such city, and they'd always name the city that this guy worked in, even though nobody but him worked there. And I think that speaks to how powerful that can permeate somebody's personality, but an organization of, you know, this is how we've always done it. This is how we did it back. You know, I look at so many agencies, their policies literally say the same verbiage as LAPD because they literally copy and paste, or somebody copied and pasted LAPD's uniform policy in the 80s, or their use of force policy in the 80s, or whatever it was. And nobody ever went back and revisited it and changed it. And, you know, that's the same kind of thing. That's what's going to get you stale. As we wrap up, before we get to your dedication, I want to ask you a question that occurred to me as we were talking, because I know what your dedication is. We've talked about it. But that being said, since I know what your dedication is, has there ever been an incident that you have looked at, and on either side of the spectrum, when you look at a mass incident, whether it's Deepwater Horizon or whether it's 9/11 or whether it's, you know, Hurricane Katrina or some of the fires in California, have you ever looked at an incident and gone, man, I really wished I could have been in charge of that one? Or is it just more of a ever increasing sequence of, man, I'm really glad I wasn't in charge of that one?
I think the second part, you know, you take some of the big ones. I think the most recent one was the submarine that sank off the East Coast.
Oh.
The Navy, the Coast Guard, the Canadian Navy and Coast Guard, and the company all working together. And I watched some of that, and you could see the incident command system working.
Mm-hmm.
But the logistics of that, I'm glad I'm not there.
Yeah.
Because you know how many people out there on boats that now you have to support for a month.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I didn't even think about the fact that doing it on land's one thing, doing it on the ocean's entirely different. Ugh.
Have you ever thought about like those incidents where you're like, man, they fucked up here and here and here. If I was there, I would have been able to fix it. Have you ever looked at those situations like that?
Well, I don't know if I ever thought that I would be able to fix it. I have seen things that, well, I would have done differently.
Right.
You know,
Right.
I won't go so far as to say, well, that would have fixed it, because maybe I don't have all the information.
Right.
Right. And you also don't know what the consequences of your decision would be, but you can obviously see a decision where you go, I would have done it differently. And then you can guess and try to factor in your decision, how that would have changed things, and try to guess a possible outcome or guess how it might have changed it. But yeah, that makes sense.
You aren't close enough to it to have all the information required.
Right. Well, Larry, it's there's so many. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of all of the vast things that you've done in 34 years in the fire service. You know, between coming in at the beginnings of ICS and going out during COVID, that's a lot of change. You know,
It's a lot of change. I'm glad I left when I did, though.
well, I mean, to me, that's like starting your career in the fire service where your PPE is a wet handkerchief tied around your nose.
Almost.
And then you finish your career where you're practically in full hazmat gear for a car fire.
Yep.
You know, so like it's a big change.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
I remember starting as an EMT, and we didn't even know what gloves were.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
You know, we didn't use gloves.
Yeah, you just touched people bloody
Yeah.
and then washed your hands off afterwards with
Holy
saline.
shit.
Yep.
Yep. I mean, it's crazy. So, Chuck, I don't know.
Holy hepatitis, dude.
Check this out. So I went to lab school, right? When I was working dope, went to lab school, and they told me that 75% of LAPD's original meth lab team or drug lab team was diagnosed with cancer. 75% of their meth labs was diagnosed with cancer. But even worse, 50% of the wives of those officers also got diagnosed with cancer.
Yep.
So
No
that shit
the
is
stuff they brought home.
that shit is so bad they brought it home with them. And I know it's no different in the fire service. You guys go into burning methyl ethyl bad shit all the time.
Well, and it stays bad shit for days.
Yeah.
Because your microparticles are in the air and you can still bring that stuff home. That's why we now have showers at the station.
Yeah.
We don't bring we change our clothes, the whole bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Try not to bring it home.
And when
It's
I
funny
worked
that you. I was gonna say it's funny that you said that about like the whole narco thing and everything, because I was actually going to say right before you said it that a friend of mine, he's a sergeant, and I'm not gonna say his name, but his whole team that went into a meth lab, he is the only survivor, and he does have cancer, and they all died of cancer, every fucking one of them.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
Mhm.
I know. I heard a story about somebody who moved a bucket of cat litter, and for one reason or other, they do use cat litter at meth labs. It's a long story, but there was a gas pocket that, because of what the cat litter is used for, and I don't want to give too much information away. I'm not trying to teach people how to make meth, but because of what the cat litter is used for, there was a gas bubble trapped inside the cat litter, and a crime scene photographer didn't know what they were doing, and they were allowed into the lab to take crime scene photos, and without any PPE on, they picked up a bucket of cat litter and moved it. Well, this gas pocket that was trapped inside the 5-gallon bucket of cat litter burped and poofed right in their face, like an air bubble, and it burped this bubble from the cat litter bucket into her face, and she lost full function in one of her lungs and a third of the function in the other lung, and medically retired from just that.
That's why we call it methyl ethyl death.
Yep.
Wow.
So, well, Larry, I appreciate you coming on. I would love to talk more to you at some time in the future. Maybe we can have you back on. I've got fascinating questions about some of the watershed events of firefighting in the last 40 years to go through, because I could give you chapter and verse on the things like North Hollywood and Rodney King, and events that made such national, Freddie Gray, all these different events that made such national news. It changed the way police work was done. But I'd be curious to hear about what you've seen as the evolution of firefighting over the 40 years that you've done it, because of when you came in versus when you went out.
Yeah.
So that'd be really cool. Chuck, before we get to what you've got, I guess, Larry, you have a dedication. And as always, we let our guests do the dedication, but yours is an interesting one. Chuck doesn't know what it is. I do. And I thought this would be a cool one.
Well, I just would like to dedicate this to all of the first responders, law enforcement, fire, medical, that lost their lives just doing their job during 9/11. Because those folks were just doing their job.
Yep.
They weren't going in to be a hero. They were just doing their job.
And it wasn't just the ones that went into the building. There have been people that have died post 9/11 from all kinds of methyl ethyl bad stuff.
And
they still are. That's something that's a generational event. And from an ICS standpoint, it changed the way ICS was done nationwide. Or I guess it changed, how the nation.
It made a paradigm shift in the way
Correct.
the East Coast handled incidents.
Yeah. So
Right.
that's I thought that was a good one for you to pick, considering the background that you've had. Thank you very much, Larry, for coming on. I appreciate your time. I'm sorry we had the technical difficulties. But Chuck, why don't you finish this out?
Well, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Larry, for coming on. If you like today's podcast and content we provide, please help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or really whatever podcast platform you listen to us on. Our podcast is available on all major streaming platforms, as well as on our YouTube. You can go to our Instagram and our Facebook. Our Instagram is @war_stories_official, and our Facebook @War Stories Podcast. If you already follow us, like and share our post. And you can also go to the link in our bio on both Instagram and Facebook and reach all of our socials or media, our website, our emails, and all that stuff. If you think you have a story you want to be a guest on the show, please go to booking.warstories@gmail.com. Again, that is booking.warstories@gmail.com, and I can get you booked. We're always looking for veterans, law enforcement, firefighters, medics, but also correction officers, dispatchers, and nurses. If you have a friend who you think would be a great fit for the show, give them our booking email and let them know about us and link us up. And if you have a story and you don't want to be featured on the show because you don't want to show your face or anything like that, but you just want to get your story out, write it up, send it to booking, and we'll read it live on the show. Thank you for the support. Stay safe.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. And until our next episode, come home with your shield or on it.